Today I'd like to share a personal story with you. I'd like to share it honestly and openly and transparently. Be as vulnerable as possible so that, number one, you can feel my pain. Number two, you can walk the journey with me. Number three, you can pray for me and with me. It started 3 years ago when my youngest child, my daughter, started watching a particular movie. And this particular movie has become so popular throughout generations of young kids. This particular movie, they dress up at their parties. They've had birthday parties on this theme. This particular movie, they speak about all the time. They rewatch it all the time. I mean, in the beginning, this movie was cute and acceptable, and now I'm just experiencing a lot of pain because all I hear is Frozen songs. Anybody who's a parent here would know that let it go. Even if you're not a parent, they're clearly still into it. If you're not a parent, do you know the song, Let It Go? I said I don't like preaching alone, and now you're just watching me. Let it go. Okay, this service clearly doesn't have baby kids. The first service, like, yeah, I'm a grandparent, I'll sing that song. So we've got songs like Let It Go. If you didn't know, I'm going to inform you. Love is an open door. For the first time in forever. Reindeers are better than people. Do you want to build a snowman? So these songs I've heard over and over and over and over again, and this has become such a painful experience in my life. My ears cannot handle when we're driving, when we're in the house watching this movie. It's constantly frozen, 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 frozen. But secretly, deep down inside, I jam to these songs. Every time the song is on, my favorite is Do You Want to Build a Snowman? I love that song. But you got to know it's an issue in my life, because as I was thinking about who I'm speaking about this week, and I got told by myself that you're speaking about Abraham. And as I thought about Abraham, the first song that popped into my head was not Father Abraham. It wasn't that. It was Into the Unknown, a Frozen song. I'll tell you why. Hebrews 11 verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Into the unknown. Now back to Frozen, because I love it so much. I want to read the lyrics for you of a specific verse that I chose from Frozen. I know it's not Christian, but just go with me. Here we go. Okay, give me the beat. You're not a voice, you're just a ringing in my ear. And if I heard you, which I don't, I'm spoken for I fear. Everyone I've ever loved is here within these walls. I'm sorry, secret siren, but I'm blocking out your calls. I've had my adventure. I don't need something new. I'm afraid of what I'm risking. I'm afraid of what I'm risking if I follow you. I don't know if our kids know what they're singing. Obviously, she's speaking to whatever she's speaking to, but if I had to make this Christian for a moment and bring it to the point of Abraham's life, Abraham could have blocked out the calls of God's life, of God's call on his life. He could have said, I don't want another adventure. I'm quite satisfied with where I'm at. I wonder how many of us actually block out God's call because he's called us, but we're saying, God, I don't want to hear it. I'm sorry, secret siren, which is God's voice. I'm blocking out the call. I wonder how many of us should be going on adventures because we serve a God who never stays stagnant. We serve a God who keeps moving, and yet we're saying, God, I don't need another adventure. I don't need something new. I'm staying where I am. This relationship with you, this is as far as I go. I wonder how many of us are in that place when God is a God who moves, which means we should constantly be on the move. Something new happening in our lives, believing for something more, believing for something bigger. Then I want to just highlight the last one. I'm afraid of what I'd be risking if I followed you. Wonder how many of us use that excuse when God's called us to do something bigger than ourselves. Abraham may have been afraid, but he went and risked anyway. He took a step of faith. Today I want to speak to us on the willingness of faith. The willingness of faith. But before I do, I want you to lean to your neighbor and say, you're not going to like this. Lean to your other neighbor and say, you're not going to like this. If you're a guest in our church, you're really not going to like this. I'm sorry. Welcome to Real Life Church, where we make you feel good. Today's not going to be a feel-good message, but it is going to be a faith-filled message, a message that's going to challenge you to your core. So if you're a guest, you're off the hook. If you've given your heart and life to Jesus, you're not. This message is not to make us all tingly and happy and sugarcoat our ears. This is a message that should increase and challenge our faith. Because often we put our faith in faith, but we should be putting our faith in God. My question for you this morning is, do we have a willing faith? Do we have a willing faith? Let's start the story of Abraham. I'm going to begin or give you some background on chapter 11, and then we're going to read chapter 12 together. It says, in Ur of Chaldeans, his hometown, called to leave this place and go where God tells him. His father is a pagan worshiper. His wife is an infertile at the time. So this is a bit of the background. He comes from this place called Ur, right? Ur of Chaldeans. Like call your son that. Hey, Ur. He's called to leave a place where he's comfortable to go, where he doesn't know. His father is a pagan worshiper, which means he didn't really worship the God, the true living God that we know, the God we serve. And his wife is infertile at the time when a promise comes that she will bear a child. And then chapter 12 goes like this, verse 1 to 10. The Lord had said to Abraham. Everyone said had. The reason the had is there, it could be an indication that there has been a prior invitation for Abraham to follow this call. Had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. Remember, his wife is infertile. And I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Everybody say, Lot went with him. One more time. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot. Everybody say Lot one more time. All the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the green tree of Moreh at Shechem. By the way, this place Shechem, if I'm saying it wrong, I'm sorry, as Roxy said last week. If I butchered it, I apologize. This place, Shechem, was actually a place Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, one of his sons, Jacob actually bought land in this place, dug a well, and then years and years later, Jesus himself encounters a woman at this well. So this is a place of history in Bible times. If you study what happened at Shechem, it's actually quite an incredible thing to find out, but I'm not going to do the studying for you. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord. Everybody say, built an altar. Who appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hill of East Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, not Ai for all the next generation people. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt. Everybody say, went down to Egypt. To live there for a while because the famine was severe. What does a willing faith look like? In the life of Abraham, we can see, number one, that a willing faith actually is a faith with obedience. A faith with obedience. Verse 4, so Abraham went as the Lord told him. God wasn't just a voice in his ear. Abraham didn't block out God's call. No, Abraham had a faith that said, God, I'm willing to risk what it takes to follow your call. I will follow you where you want to take me. The key thought here is that by faith, Abraham obeyed God. By faith, not by anything else. By faith, Abraham obeyed God. His decision was between setting out on this adventure into the unknown with his wife, not sure what's coming to happen, or staying right where he was. That's the decision that each one of us sitting here would face multiple times in our lives. He had to decide between the security of what he already had and the uncertainty of traveling under God's direction. With faith, these decisions will constantly steer us in the faith. The security and comfort that you have, or being guided by God's direction. As I say in Kitchener, here's your choice today. Stay where you are, exactly who you are, or go under God's direction. Emma, stay where you are today. It's fine. Your faith is great. Or be guided by God's direction. Conrad, be guided by God's direction, or stay where you are in the comfort of your life, the security of what you may face. This is what we'll be facing with in our lives. Walking in faith is going to cost us. It's going to cause us to think, which decision do I need to make today? My comfort and security, or what God wants for my life? Can I remind you, all Abraham had to go on was God's promise. God's promise to guide him and bless him. That's hectic. There's no way Abraham in this moment could have visualized what his decision would have impacted for history. He couldn't have thought how this would have affected history. His obedience, saying yes to God. Yes, God, his promise was, I will make you a father of great nations. That was the promise. But saying yes in that time, his obedience in that moment, he could not have visualized what this looked like. I wonder how many of us, because we haven't been obedient, have not been affecting history in the making. Church, our obedience affects history. And so does our lack of obedience. You saying no to God's call, you not stepping out in faith, you not doing what God's called you to do, you shying away, being scared and not stepping out, you not being daring in your faith may affect history in a way that it shouldn't have been affected. We need to do what God has called us to do. A willing faith takes a faith with obedience. Can I remind you that faith and obedience cannot be separated? They go hand in hand. My favorite line in this church is like cook sisters. They intertwine with one another. It's like the sun and light. It's like fire and heat. You cannot separate it. And actually the sun and heat in this week and the week before that and this heat wave has been hectic. And it's hot in here now, but it's this, you can't separate heat and sun and light. So you cannot separate faith and obedience. Does your faith cause a willingness to be obedient? Even if that requires sacrifice. Verse 2 says, he went from go from your country, your people, and your father's household. God at the time commanded Abraham to leave his country, his family, his home. And I think we can often miss what happened here because we don't know the background, what he actually had to leave, what he had to give up to say yes to the call of God on his life, to say yes to being the father of faith. And the Bible even calls him a friend of God more than once. Imagine being called that. A father of faith. What did he have to give up? Let me give you some background on where he was brought up. Which I told you earlier, later known as Babylon, was a port city of the Euphrates River. It was a place of many gods being worshipped, a lot of nature gods being worshipped. So a lot of idolatry happened within his city, in his hometown. Can you just think that for a moment? You were brought up in a place that's not really godly, and yet you've been called to be the father of faith. What shaped him there? Yet he says yes to the call of God. I wonder how many of us have used the excuse that our childhood, the way we were brought up, where we were brought up, what we were brought up from, what our family believes has actually hindered us from stepping out in the call of God. Anyway, carrying on. This place, was known for its legal justice and cultural activities. Among its treasures are some of the most valuable artifacts archaeologists has ever found. Was not some rinky-dinky small place in the middle of nowhere. It was a place of good civilization ahead of its time for all the places around it. It was a place where it was advanced civilization. And then when Abraham responds, he says no to all of that to say yes to God. He says no to this modern city, his well-established life, to say yes to God, to go where he doesn't even know where he's being sent. He gives up his prestige, his security, his material possessions, because it says, leave your family, your household, everything, leave it all to follow me. Abraham exercises faith and obeys God. When God calls you to take a step of faith, a daring step of faith, there may be a brief struggle within your soul. It's understandable. There may be a brief struggle in your soul because of what it may cost you. But we need to step out in daring faith. Verse 2 then says, to the land that I will show you. Go to the land that I will show you. Abraham went into the unknown because he trusted the one who knows all things. He trusted the one who knows all things. I wonder if we're sitting here today, the reason we can't step out in faith is because we don't trust the one who knows all things. Not to the degree that's going to get us to cross over that comfort mark. He trusted the one who knows all things. It was a risk, but faith always comes with risk. We're never just going to know the end result. We're never going to know what God's called us to do fully. He always gives us glimpses. That's what I love about running church the most, is I'll never know what's coming next. It's just crazy. You never know what's coming next. It takes risk. Faith is self-surrender to God. It's giving up all dependency upon visible security in your life and saying yes to the unseen God to direct your whole life. Faith is the conviction of things not seen. It's a risky investment, but can I remind you who you're investing into? What you're investing into. The kingdom. You're investing into God. And so this risk is worth the take because it will always pay out. Just might not pay out in your generation. It might not pay out in your generation. This risk you're taking now may affect you and your family, but it may also or only come true with the next generation, with generations to come. But I remind you, God will fulfill his promises, but it's going to require faith obedience. The reality, church, is that God may be trying to lead you to a place of greater service and greater usefulness to him. So don't let your comfort and security and your present position limit you from what God wants to do in your life. A willing faith takes obedience, but a willing faith also takes a faithful commitment to God. A faithful commitment to God. We look at Abraham as perfect. As Rock said last week, we look at Noah as perfect. He said yes, he built an ark, he followed the instruction, but he wasn't a perfect man. He made mistakes, he messed up along the way. And that is true of Abraham too. He made mistakes in his life as well. He didn't start as a hero of faith, he grew into being who God had called him to be. He left his hometown, yes, but there was a delay in his life. From his hometown, firstly, number one is his father led them out of their hometown to a place called Haran. And there they stayed for plus minus 15 years when he was called to Canaan, but they pit stopped in a place that they was never called to. And by the way, Haran actually, if you translate it, is actually called delay. The place's name is delay. He was told specifically to leave his family, which included Terah and Lot. Terah, his dad, and Lot. Let's go back to what we read. Who did he take with him? Lot. Took Lot with him. But God instructed, leave your family, your father's household. So he wasn't a hero of faith from the word go. He spent 15 years. He went all the way, supposed to go to the promised land, but he stopped in Haran. It's like us moving from Johannesburg to Durban and stopping in Pietermaritzburg for 15 years. Like, it's right there, but it's not. It's almost there. I don't know what's closer than Pietermaritzburg to Durban, but it's right there. But we're not in the promise of what God's called us to. Then we see in verse 10, and this is where we really see Abraham's faith being tested. Verse 10 says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because of the famine was so severe. The hero of faith didn't start out as a hero. He grew in faith and obedience. Verse 1 to 9 in Genesis 12 actually is a testimony of Abraham's faith, but then verse 10 to 20 is actually the test of Abraham's faith. So we can see that, yeah, he may have failed the test. The Bible never flatters its heroes. It gives us raw. This was Abraham. He messed up along the way, but he's still called the father of faith. That should give us some hope that when we're daring for faith, when generations look at us like, oh, you may have a little bit of a speed bump there, but don't worry, you could still become who God has called you to become. Oh man, you messed up big time this time, but you can still come back to God's call for your life. If he could do it for Abraham, he can do it for us. If he could do it for Noah, he can do it for us. Enoch was just great. He just walked with God for 300 years. Let's go, Enoch, woohoo. But before that, he actually didn't know God. God called him. He got saved. It seems that Abraham didn't believe that God could meet his needs in the promised land. So he went to Egypt. He lapsed in faith. He pushed the panic button, pushed the eject button, and went to Egypt. But the will of God for him was to be in Canaan, not Egypt. That was God's will for him, being in Canaan, not Egypt. By the way, the land of Canaan was the focal point for most of the history of Israel. And it impacts our history so much. Some theologians believe that because Abraham left Canaan to Egypt in the time of famine, that he actually left God's will for his life at that moment. God willed him to be in Canaan, and he just left it for a moment to go to Egypt. And if you start looking at what happens in Egypt, he starts lying about his wife not being his wife. The king, which is a pagan king, actually rebukes him. I mean, a Christian gets rebuked by the world. He carries more baggage out of Egypt than what he went into Egypt, all because he didn't trust God for the momentary need. Abraham, like most of us, found it easier to trust God in the far off promises than the right now needs. I mean, a lot of us can trust, yeah, this year the church is going to triple, let's go. Yeah, but what about today? We trust in the far off promises of God way easier than the right now needs in our lives. God, you know what I need. If God calls us, then why does he bring trials? If God's called me, why does he bring trials? I mean, we look at the life of Abraham. Why would he have a famine happen when Abraham was called to the promised land? And now there's a famine. Now they don't have food anymore. What on earth is happening here? Can you imagine his wife's reaction at that time? All the women in the house know exactly. You are the head of the home, mister. Now you told us that you heard from God. Can you just imagine? Abraham must have been like, and she was like, now you bring us to the promised land. Ooh, the promised land. Like, it's the promised land. Promised famine, yes. Why would you bring us to the promised land? Look at this. Why would God do this to us? And Abraham probably in the moment going, yes, did I hear right? I should clean my ear. God, did I hear you right? Why did this happen? To test Abraham's faith. Trials are going to happen in your life to test your faith. Faith isn't faith unless it's been tested. How will you know if your faith is real unless it's been tested? I mean, easy 1, 2, 3 faith is not the reality. I'm sorry for whichever pastor lied to you that said, just have faith. There's an element for us to just have faith. But there's also an element that when you're going in the valley to recognize that God is still sovereign. That your faith is not what He's going to do for you, but who He is. Have faith. Faith 101, your faith won't develop unless you meet resistance. Your faith will not develop unless you meet resistance. It won't grow if it's just blessing after blessing, mountain peak after mountain peak, because it's in the valley that your faith grows. We sang it this morning, I'll praise you on the mountain, I'll praise you in the valley. Bunch of liars, including myself. Because we sing that song and then the valley happens, it's like, God, praise you right now. Faith is saying, God, I recognize you on the mountain. I recognize you as God and sovereign in the valley. And I know that my faith is growing. I may not understand this. This is wrecking me. But God, I'm going to hold on to faith. Because faith is, daring faith. That's why I said this theme, I was excited for it. No, I'm not. Because it's going to come with resistance. We want to build this church. We want to see salvation happen. It's going to come with resistance. But we know that that's going to grow our faith. And eventually, hopefully, someone will say, the next generation will say, heroes of faith. Because they didn't have little watered down faith. They were heroes of faith. They went through the worst and they stood their ground. Heroes of faith. We want to see a church full of heroes of faith, daring to believe that anything is possible even if it doesn't happen. Craig Rochelle says, we may enjoy God on the mountaintop, but we learn to trust Him in the valley. It's lacquer on the mountaintop. Listen, we are human. We love the mountaintops. Why do you think Heart for the House was so difficult? We knew, as soon as we do this, we're going to be met with resistance. They knew. Multiple conversations we had, we're going to be met with resistance. And the resistance after resistance after resistance, but God. But God. Keep your faith. We enjoy God on the mountaintop, but we learn to trust Him in the valley. Now, many people may have died from this hunger, from this famine. But maybe, just maybe, Abraham was wrong to leave Canaan to go to Egypt. When we are tested, we often believe our actions are good. Like to quit is fine. When we're tested, we feel like it's okay to take a step back from God. Because I'm going through the most right now. But can we encourage you to step in deeper? Side note, very important side note, which I realized, is there was no mention of altars, prayer, or worship in Egypt or in Haran. There was mention of altars in Canaan when Abraham was in God's will. It mentioned he built altars. It mentioned he prayed. It mentioned he worshipped. But it didn't mention that in Haran, and it didn't mention that in Egypt. Why? Because maybe, just maybe, when we're outside of God's will, it's hard for us to realize that we need to pray, that we need to worship, that we need to set up an altar to remember what God's goodness is, what He's done for us. When we're not in God's will, right now, if you're finding it hard to pray and worship and set up altars of remembrance, maybe, just maybe, you're out of line in God's will for your life. God is in the business of growing Abraham into a man of great faith. And He wants to grow each one of us, ordinary people, dwarf people like me. But He wants to make us people of great faith who will inspire generations to come. I love this quote from D. Barnas. Faith is not a mushroom that grows overnight in damp soil. It's an oak tree that grows for 1,000 years under the blast of the wind and the rain. There's a lot of mushroom faiths in Krugersdorp. Those faiths that go fraught after a while. Those faiths that you can just trample on. But this is the kind of faith that we need as a church. Daring faith to say, I am an oak tree kind of faith. A faith that when the winds come and the rain come and the storms come, I'm going to stand my ground. A faith that's going to keep believing no matter what comes my way. A faith that's going to know that God is God no matter what I experience, no matter what I face. A faith that's saying, God, you are sovereign. You are Lord of my life. And this wobbly, as hard as it is, this valley, no matter if I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm going to be an oak tree that keeps standing my ground. Just keep trusting God. You know, there's some theologians that believe Abraham going to Egypt wasn't all that bad. They said, listen, Abraham maybe should have just used intelligence to seek opportunity for what God wanted him to do in Egypt. Now, whatever viewpoint is correct, the theme still remains the same. Trust God. Believe in God. If you're being tested, look for opportunity. If you're being tested, allow your faith to be grown. Don't quit on God. Be daring enough to not quit, to believe, keep on believing. Be daring enough to keep believing. Be daring enough to not excuse your excuses. This is the reason why I haven't done a 10 list. I've thought about it. Some of you overthinkers. Be daring enough to follow God above the risk. Be daring enough to do God's will for your life. Be daring enough to be obedient. Be daring enough to follow Him into the unknown. Be daring enough to leave behind what is required to be sacrificed. Be daring enough to be faithfully committed to God. And even if you lapse in faith, if you push the panic button and the eject button because you're in a hard time of your life, be daring enough to try again. Try again, try again, try again. You know, the worst lie of the enemy is when we get to a place where we're not reading our Bible, we're not praying, and you start thinking, I'm not good enough, I don't actually care about God, look what He's done in my life. No, look what He's done to me. When we start blaming God, that's a lie of the enemy. Try again. Get up and try again. I told our life builders this past week, since Roxy's preached last week, the question was yes. What are you going to say yes to? And I really felt God compelling me to say yes to a life of prayer. Now you're like, you're a pastor, you should be praying. Let me clarify. Not a prayer where quiet time, reading my Bible, thank you, Jesus, good morning, good night, and in the meantime, but moments where I spend hours in His presence, praying, seeking, and sometimes just shutting up so He can speak. And as I said yes to that, 2 days later, I failed already. I was like, seriously? But we have to be reminded to try again. Try again. So Tuesday I got up and I tried again. Sat in my office, my earphones on so I don't hear everybody else, and worshiped Jesus. Prayed in His presence. Practically, what did Abraham do? He went in obedient faith. He set up altars of prayer and worship. He was reminded of God's faithfulness in his life. Can I just say, Abraham wouldn't have survived spiritually if he didn't have all these things set in place. He went to a place where he renewed his loyalty and love to God through prayer, through worship, through places where he can remember God's faithfulness. So this morning, as you close your eyes, in response to this message, I guess the call is to renew your love and loyalty to God. Renew your love and loyalty to God. Perhaps you've been too scared to go where He's asked you to go. Whether that's ministering in your workplace, restoring your marriage, asking for forgiveness, giving exponentially. I don't know what it is, but maybe God's called you to something that seems way too extreme. Perhaps you've been too scared. Perhaps you've come up with excuses because the risk to go that way is way too big. Perhaps you've lacked obedience in the smallest area of your life or the largest area of your life. Perhaps you've lapsed in your faith. You've pushed the panic button, you've ejected. Perhaps God has not been directing your life and your decisions, and if we're going to live a life of faith, we need Him to direct every part of us, not just what we want from Him. Perhaps you haven't been faithfully committed to God as you should be. Perhaps you're in a season of testing and you're not sure if you can carry on. Perhaps you're ready to follow God. You're ready to dare. Dare to step into the unknown. Dare to go on an adventure with God. Dare to follow Him. But if we're going to get any of that right, No matter where you find whichever perhaps you're in right now, we need to come to a place where we renew our love for Jesus.